How's it going, everyone? It's Abysmal Bloom, and welcome to my TED Talk on why you should be on Board Breakers this format, especially if you're playing Purrely. So, I'm making this video after Robin Dillon topped another event yet again with Purrely Board Breakers. So, this video we're going to be really going over why this board breaking approach is a lot better than hand traps, the best board breakers to consider, and finally, how to play versus the meta threats. But before we jump into this video, don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I really like throwing Purrely content out there, and this just lets me know you guys enjoy it too. I've also been messing around with a few other decks. So I've been playing Blue Eyes, Argostar, and even the new Odeon deck. So if you guys want to hear anything about that stuff as well, leave a comment below and I might actually just get some stuff out there for that. With all that being said, let's actually jump back into the video. So starting off with, why do we even want to consider board breakers? To be honest, board breakers isn't a bad approach generally. The only times it's bad is if the meta really is focusing on a hand rip strategy or maybe even an OTK strategy. So in the current meta, we do have to worry about Mermail, but except that one matchup, majority of what you're going to be facing is something that board breakers really can help you deal with. So speaking of the meta, what we're talking about right now is specifically Ryzeal, Maliss, and Blue Eyes. And if you look at how they like to play out their decks, you'll notice that all of these decks have the same ability to do a bunch of layered board building. Basically, they have key points where if you don't interact with them, they get to set up a larger board, and so you do need to play hand traps to try and slow those stuff down. But the biggest weakness about this is even with all of that, they still can pivot into maybe an end board of one or two solid interactions, and even with all of that, they probably also have hand traps in their hand. And so to effectively shut down your opponent, you need something like 2 to 3 hand traps, and sometimes that's not even enough because your opponent could be on stuff like Talents, Thrust, Call by the Grave, and this just lets them play through these hand traps as well. So yeah, all of that plus the fact that the opponent can still probably play through this just kind of makes hand traps not ideal. So the other approach is just let your opponent build out a board and you just break it. So let's actually talk about the advantages of board breaking. Well, again, to effectively shut down your opponent's board, you now actually need 1 to 3 board breakers. And this may seem like not that much of a difference, but it's huge, especially in a deck like Purrely, where you need to discard a card anyways. The best part about board breaking is top decking a board breaker as your 6th card is very effective still. You can still shut down your opponent with something like an Ultimate Slayer as your top deck versus drawing an Ash Blossom. So because there's a need to draw 2 to 3 hand traps to shut down your opponent, you can see people playing somewhere between 16 to maybe even 20 hand traps. But because we have the ability to play with 6 cards, you can see the count of board breakers needed being less, which means you can change your deck style to be less bricky and still be as effective. Now, what are the disadvantages with board breaking? Well, for one, going first with the board breaker approach is not ideal. They really shine when there is a board to break, after all. So that's why you usually want to use them in a going second strategy, like Tempai, for example. And it's usually very powerful in those strategies because you just want to break a board, just go for your damage, and you're fine. But that's not going to work with Purrely. You still want to go first. But the biggest difference between the Purrely strategy and something like Tempai is the fact that we can actually make a huge towers monster to sit back on. And so, because nobody's able to out the Purrely Noir, you can actually wait out a few turns and just use a very effective board breaker in the following turn. So what this means is we're not trying to go for a full list of complete blowouts. So we actually counter all of this with a strategy of playing somewhat versatile board breakers that can be used going first. So let's actually look at why Purrely specifically is a good approach for board breaking versus the other decks in the meta. Well, first off, I already mentioned it before, but Purrely's strategy of making an unaffected towers monster is OP. There's a reason why Chaos Angel is already very good in this format, and it's because once it's made with the light and dark materials, unless you have an imperm to out the Chaos Angel, it's effectively just going to be stuck on the board because your opponent can't out it. So our game plan really is in the same suit. With Purrely Noir, you're really just trying to get to 1 to 2 delicious memories and even a pretty memory to just close out the game. And you don't need to try and break the opponent's board or OTK with that. You just want to sit back on it as a wall that they cannot break. You just wait out a few turns, get to your board breakers, clear out the opponent's board, and then go from there. So this is only something that Purrely can do. If you look at the other decks in the meta, you've got stuff like Blue Eyes, which automatically their playstyle kind of pushes them towards hand traps because they can search stuff like Effect Veiler. But even if you look at Maliss and Ryzeal, for example, even though they also have a draw engine packed into their kit, they can't guarantee just sitting back and surviving till the next turn. They don't have a towers monster they can rely on, and that's the biggest difference. Maliss and Ryzeal are kind of just forced to bank on their hand traps to just really shut down you from getting to what you want to do and hope for the best. But because nobody is on Purrely's weaknesses right now, which are Herald of the Abyss and the Kaijus, you're invincible. We're effectively building a board that cannot be broken over, and then with our board breakers, we're going for that extremely powerful effects to just clear out the opponent's board. So, with this strategy, what do we have to watch out for? First off, for the board breakers, we do have to worry about stuff like Xyz Encore and the Book of Moon variations, so stuff like Book of Eclipse. Specifically, they're not that popular right now, but they can come up. For example, if you're facing a rogue deck that really loses to something like an Abyss Dweller, they probably have to side in Xyz Encore at least because it's really good at dealing with the Abyss Dweller. As for the Book of Moon variations, it is something that you may see, but it isn't that popular. As for hand traps, I wouldn't say any of the hand traps listed below are particularly effective. They all really depend on the hand you open versus the hand the opponent opens. And so, yeah, it just really depends on how everything works out. Purrely, in general, can play through it. If you just open 2 quick plays, you usually have the ability to do something, even if any of these hand traps hit you. It's really something that's hand dependent and really based off of how well you know how to play Purrely. As for Floodgates, the only one you really care about is Xyz Encore because it prevents you from even making a rank 2. Except for the one situation, you're pretty much fine. There's also the fact that Dimensional Barrier is kind of just being played at 1 with a thrust package. So most likely your opponent isn't really going to get to that card, especially if you aren't playing any hand traps. So with all that being said, what is the board breaking lineup? I already mentioned this before, but we're going to classify our board breakers into complete blowouts and the versatile board breakers. Our first few cards for complete blowouts are specifically Ultimate Slayer, Dark Ruler No More, and versus back row heavy decks, we got Lightning Storm and Feather Duster. And these cards by themselves do a lot to deal with most of the boards in the meta right now. For example, Ultimate Slayer by itself shuts down most likely both the Blue Eyes and the Ryzeal decks. As for the versatile board breakers, we have stuff like Metal Tronus and the Black Goat Laughs, which are surprisingly effective even going first or second. And the Black Goat Laughs is honestly probably one of my favorite tactics, and this is really cool, especially if you pair it with the Foolish Burial Goods, because now you have Foolish Burial Goods as a card that can help you with your engine stuff, or even just be a board breaker. Other versatile board breakers are Call by the Grave and like the Book of Moon variations. Call by the Grave in general is decent when going first because you can deal with hand traps, but it's also good as a blowout going second because you can use it versus Blue Eyes and even the Maliss matchup. So they're pretty good one of removals. We have a few honorable mentions. Crossout Designator is something you could consider if you're really worried about that dimensional barrier. But in a board breaking list, otherwise it's not really effective because you're not really playing hand traps that your opponent would use on you. Imperm is something that you can play. It is a hand trap, but if you draw it as your 6th card, you can still use it to just shut down one card. So it is a board breaker you can consider. We also have Ash Blossom and Mulch Armies, and Ash Blossom is kind of there just because if you're playing a variation of Purrely, it can be nice to just be able to stop something like a Mulch Army, and Ash Blossom is still decent when going second to just kind of shut down a play your opponent's trying to do. I do want to mention if you do use it, it does leave you prone to stuff like Talents and Thrust again, and that may be a reason not to play it. So what about when we go first? Because we already talked about how this is a board breaking approach. What does our side deck look like, and what we really try to accomplish when we're going first? So in the case we go first, we're actually going to take out majority of our extremely powerful board breakers, and what we're going to switch in place of them are really powerful floodgates. So we can switch into stuff like our Artifact Sanctums, our Mischief of the Gnomes, Simmel Archfiend, Dimensional Barrier, Different Dimension Ground, and these are all good for the same purpose. You still want to get to them. Thrust can also get you to them, and on top of all this, it's just a huge shutdown for the decks that you really care about it. On top of that, you can consider also really potent hand traps, for example, like Droll and Lockbird and Artifact Lancier good. You could also consider stuff like Ash Blossom and Imperm, but on top of all this, you're also just going to be playing your versatile board breakers. So your Call by the Graves, your Book of Moons, and even your Talents and Thrust, all of that stuff. An honorable mention is Spooky Dogwood, and this is because, as I mentioned before, you are going for a grind game approach of just sitting on a towers and waiting it out until you get to your out. So this can lead to certain games going into time, though I do personally think that's not likely the case. Spooky Dogwood can come up in certain matchups because of the actual playstyle you're going for. So with all that being said, let's look at how we want to play versus the different decks. First up is Ryzeal. And so going first, our ideal play is playing something like Dimensional Barrier or Mischief of the Gnomes to really shut them down for going for that rank 4 play. I do want to note that if you do play Dimensional Barrier, it also does hit your Purrely Noir as well, in the aspect that it cannot respond at all to anything the Ryzeal matchup is trying to do. So the other option is playing Mischief of the Gnomes, and this one's really good if you're facing a pure or even a Mitsurugi variation, just because it does mess with the levels. And because of the fact that you can activate this from the graveyard as well, it means that if you're playing the Foolish Burial Goods package, this is a card you could consider as well. As for the going second cards that are really effective, we've got Ultimate Slayer, Dark Ruler No More, and Mulch Army, which are really good at just shutting down what your opponent's trying to do. And then finally, for the one of or the versatile board breakers, we've got Metal Tronus, the Black Goat Laughs, Xyz Encore, and then we've also got stuff like Talents, Thrust, Book of Moon, Imperm, and these are all kind of decent because you can deal with one threat. So Droll and Lockbird, Ash Blossom, those are also kind of decent for the same reasons. As for the Maliss variants, you've got Artifact Sanctum, Simmel Archfiends, and honestly you could even consider stuff like Book of Moon for when you're going first. As for when you're going second, you really want to just hit their back row, so Feather Duster and Lightning Storm is huge. But on top of that, Ultimate Slayer is actually a pretty solid card because you can dump Bacephalus to get rid of one of their link bodies, and then you can use Bacephalus effect to dump a Garuda, draw one, and so it took care of one body on their board and it replaced itself as a resource in your hand. And then on top of that, obviously you want to consider the Mulch Armies. Dark Ruler No More is also a decent option at dealing with their end board, because you can at least shut down their Owlbow as well as their Nightmare Griffin. As for general threats that are good versus them going first and second, we've got Lancia, Talon's Thrust, the Black Goat Lass, Metal Tronus, Call by the Grave, and then finally Ash Blossom and Imperm. For the final matchup, we've got Blue Eyes, and for going first versus that deck, you want to either play Different Dimension Ground or Dimensional Barrier. It's surprising how important the graveyard is for Blue Eyes, and so honestly, Different Dimension Ground probably just shuts them down completely. You've also got cards for going second versus them, and stuff like Ultimates there shuts them down heavily. Dark Ruler No More is also pretty effective at stopping them from doing anything. Mulch armies make their board weaker and give you that same hand advantage. And then obviously we've got Feather Duster and Lightning Storm that can be decent because it can hit their True Light. But you want to pair that with something like a Dark Ruler No More to prevent their board from actually activating anything. Finally, for cards that are generally good versus them, we've got Droll and Lockbird, Metal Tronus, which you can actually use with the same ultimates their targets, so just dump them along, and it's very good at dealing with the board. You've got Talents and Thrust, which really depends on if they have the negate for it set up, but it can be decent to help you get into more resources. And the same is the case for Book of Moon. We've also got Call by the Grave, which can be effective, but it really again depends on what their end board is. And then Ash Blossom and Imperm are again generally just kind of okay versus the deck. So final thoughts with all of this, I will say board breaking Purrely is probably a really good contender for this current meta. The goal is pretty simple. You're trying to clear your opponent's threats with your board breakers, get to your Purrely Noir, and basically just win in the grind game. If your opponent can't out Purrely Noir, they can't beat your board. It's just that simple. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for more Yu-Gi-Oh content. Let me know what board breakers you guys end up trying to use with this Purrely build. I hope you guys enjoy. Good luck on your events, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.